The world for Ilara Vance was a tapestry woven from shades of gray. It was the gray of the pre-dawn sky she saw from the bus stop on her way to her first job, the gray of the worn linoleum in her mother's cramped apartment, and the gray of the perpetual exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. Her life was a meticulously balanced equation of survival. 2 jobs, night classes for a paralegal certificate, and the ever-present gnawing anxiety of her mother's mounting medical bills. Her mother, Maeve, was the only spot of color in her world, a fragile watercolor fading with each hacking cough. On a Tuesday drenched in the scent of rain and antiseptic, the watercolor washed away completely. But before she left, Maeve clutched Ilara's hand, her voice a reedy whisper, and gave her a truth that would set her world on fire. "Your father, he isn't who you think," Maeve rasped, her eyes wide with a lifetime of secrets. "His name is Marcus Thorne." The name meant nothing to Ilara. "Thorne Industries," Maeve clarified, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "I was his secretary. A long time ago. He's a very powerful man, Ilara. He didn't want you." She pressed a small, tarnished silver locket into Ilara's palm. Inside, a faded photograph showed a younger, vibrant Maeve standing beside a man with a jawline carved from granite and eyes as cold and clear as a winter sky. Marcus Thorne. A week after the funeral, fueled by a cocktail of grief, desperation, and a flicker of naive hope, Ilara took a bus to the other side of the city. The journey was a transition between dimensions. The gray, crowded streets gave way to wide, tree-lined avenues. The cramped tenements were replaced by palatial estates, hidden behind wrought iron gates. Thorne Manor was the most imposing of them all, a stone behemoth that seemed to command the very land it sat upon. Her cheap blazer felt like a costume. The security guard eyed her with suspicion, but the name Maeve Vance and the desperate sincerity in her voice somehow got her through the gates. A severe-looking housekeeper led her into a cavernous hall where the silence was so profound it had weight. Marcus Thorne was older than in the photograph. His hair a distinguished silver, but his eyes were the same. He stood before a massive fireplace, flanked by 2 people who were clearly his children. They were Ilara's age, gilded and polished to a blinding sheen. The young man, Julian, had his father's jaw but a sneer that was all his own. He looked at Ilara's worn shoes and his lip curled. The young woman, Serafina, was a porcelain doll of a person, her beauty marred by an expression of utter disdain. Ilara's voice trembled as she explained who she was, her mother's story tumbling out in a raw, unpolished flood. She held out the locket as proof. Marcus Thorne didn't even look at it. His face was an unreadable mask of stone. It was Serafina who broke the silence, a laugh like shattering glass. "Oh, Daddy, another one. This is the 3rd this year. They must be crawling out of the woodwork." "Look at her," Julian added, his voice dripping with contempt. "She smells of desperation and cheap fabric. You expect us to believe you share our blood. You're a gutter rat trying to cash in on a lie." Ilara's fragile hope shattered. Humiliation, hot and acidic, flooded her veins. She looked at Marcus, pleading with her eyes for a flicker of recognition, of paternal warmth, of anything. He gave her nothing. He simply sighed, a sound of profound inconvenience. "This is a private family matter," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. He turned to his son. "Julian, have security escort her out, and give her something for her trouble." Julian strode forward and pulled a thick money clip from his pocket. He peeled off several large bills and threw them on the marble floor at Ilara's feet. "Here," he sneered. "Go buy yourself a new life. One that doesn't involve us." The paper fluttered to a rest by her scuffed shoes. The world seemed to narrow to that small pile of money, an insult, a dismissal, a valuation of her entire existence. Something inside Ilara, something that had been bent and weathered by poverty, finally snapped. The grief for her mother curdled into a cold, hard resolve. She looked up, meeting Julian's eyes, then Serafina's, and finally Marcus's. She memorized their faces, the architecture of their contempt. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply turned, leaving the money untouched on the cold floor, and walked out of their perfect, sterile world. As the iron gates of Thorn Manor closed behind her, Ilara made a silent vow. They had rejected her name. They had humiliated her mother's memory. They had treated her as less than human. She would not seek their acceptance. She would not beg for their love. She would dismantle their lives, piece by glittering, hollow piece. The Forge. 5 years of silence. The woman who left Thorn Manor was Ilara Vance. The woman who emerged 5 years later was a different entity entirely. She called herself Lena Petrova. The first year was the hardest. Ilara sold her mother's small apartment and everything in it. She worked 3 jobs, sleeping in 4-hour shifts, her body running on caffeine and pure, unadulterated rage. The memory of the money on the floor, of their sneering faces, was the fuel that burned away her exhaustion. She used the money to disappear. She moved to a different city, enrolled in a top-tier university under a scholarship, and legally changed her name. Ilara Vance was a ghost. Lena Petrova was a blank slate. She chose her weapons with surgical precision: finance and corporate law. She devoured textbooks, her mind a sponge for arcane market theories, loopholes in tax codes, and the brutal poetry of hostile takeovers. She wasn't just smart, she was obsessed. While other students partied, she ran stock market simulations. While they networked, she studied the corporate filings of Thorn Industries until she could recite them from memory. She understood that to beat the Thorns, she had to become more than their equal. She had to become their superior. She shed her past like a snakeskin. She polished her accent until it was a smooth, unplaceable mid-Atlantic cadence. She used a portion of her student loans to buy a single, exquisitely tailored suit. She learned about wine, art, and classical music, not for pleasure but for camouflage. She learned the language of the elite so she could use it to cut their throats. All the while she watched them. The internet was her spyglass. She followed Serafina's vapid social media presence, cataloging her extravagant parties, her designer clothes, and her much-publicized charity, the Serafina Thorn Foundation for Underprivileged Artists. She read every financial report from Thorn Industries, noting Julian's recent promotion to head of the acquisitions department and his aggressive high-risk investment strategies. She tracked Marcus's public appearances, his carefully curated image as a titan of industry, a pillar of the community. She built a web of information connecting data points, finding patterns, and identifying weaknesses. She saw that their empire was not built on solid rock, but on the shifting sands of reputation, arrogance, and debt. After graduating at the top of her class, Lena Petrova secured a coveted analyst position at a rival investment bank, Sterling Cole. She was relentless, sharp, and emotionally detached, earning a reputation as a prodigy. No one knew the fire that burned behind her cool, gray eyes. No one knew that every transaction, every analysis, was a training exercise for the war to come. She was forging herself into a weapon, and she was almost ready to be aimed. The takedown, a symphony of ruin. Lena's first target was the heir apparent, Julian Thorn. She knew from his public statements and leaked company memos that Julian was desperate to outshine his father. He favored bold, risky ventures, believing himself a maverick. His arrogance was his Achilles heel. From her position at Sterling Cole, Lena began to build a complex financial trap. She identified a mid-size biotech firm that Julian had been circling, a company with promising but unproven technology. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward play he couldn't resist. Working through anonymous shell corporations and encrypted networks, skills she had painstakingly acquired, Lena began to manipulate the narrative around the biotech firm. She fed positive, but subtly misleading, data into financial forums she knew Julian's analysts monitored. She commissioned a glowing, but ultimately superficial research paper from a little-known European firm. She created the illusion of a bidding war, driving the acquisition price up. Julian, blinded by ambition and the desire to land a whale, took the bait. He convinced the Thorn Industries board to over-leverage the company for the acquisition. The deal was hailed in the financial press as a bold move by the young Thorn. The day the deal closed, Lena executed the second phase of her plan. She released a meticulously compiled dossier of the biotech firm's real data to a notoriously aggressive short-selling firm. The data showed that the firm's flagship technology had failed its third-stage clinical trials, a fact that had been cleverly buried in complex scientific jargon. The short sellers attacked. The biotech firm's stock price didn't just drop, it plummeted into the abyss. Thorn Industries lost billions overnight. The bold move became Julian's folly. Marcus was forced to publicly sideline his son, and the board initiated an internal investigation. Julian's reputation was shattered, his career in ruins. He wasn't just fired from his position of power. He was humiliated in the very arena where he believed himself a god. Ilara, watching the fallout on a news ticker from her sterile office, felt a cold, satisfying click in her soul. One down. Next was Serafina. Serafina's world was built on the fragile scaffolding of social standing. Her charity was her crown jewel, a vehicle for her to grace magazine covers and rub shoulders with the truly influential. Lena's research had revealed that the Serafina Thorn Foundation for Underprivileged Artists was little more than a slush fund. A significant portion of the donations were funneled into covering the exorbitant costs of its fundraising galas, Serafina's couture wardrobe, and consulting fees paid to her friends. Lena didn't need to manipulate markets for this. She just needed a spotlight. She hired a forensic accountant, an old, brilliant man who was quietly disgraced and eager for a payday. Working through a secure cutout, she provided him with all the public filings and insider information she had gathered. He followed the money, and the trail was more damning than Lena had even hoped. She packaged the accountant's findings, bank statements, inflated invoices, offshore transfers, and leaked the entire file to a hungry investigative journalist she'd been cultivating for months. The journalist was a young woman with a reputation for taking down sacred cows. The story broke on a Sunday, a multi-page exposé in a major newspaper titled, "The Tarnished Tiara: How the Serafina Thorn Foundation Robs the Poor to Entertain the Rich." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The city's elite, terrified of being associated with a scandal, abandoned Serafina overnight. Her invitations were rescinded. Her name became a punchline in gossip columns. The Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation. Serafina, the porcelain princess, was now a social pariah, trapped in her mansion, watching her perfect world burn down on television. Her reputation, the only currency she had ever valued, was now worthless. Two down. The final target was the king himself, Marcus Thorn, and his legacy, Thorn Industries. This was the masterstroke, the culmination of 5 years of silent, obsessive work. During her deep dive into the company's history, Lena had discovered a ghost in their archives. In the late 1990s, one of Thorn's chemical plants in a small rural town had been responsible for a catastrophic leak of toxic waste into the local water supply. It led to a cluster of birth defects and rare cancers. Marcus Thorn, then a young CEO, had used his immense power to crush the story. He had bought the silence of local officials, intimidated families with armies of lawyers, and buried the evidence so deep it was practically myth. Lena spent 2 years meticulously unearthing that myth. She hired private investigators to track down the victims' families, many of whom had been scattered and broken by the tragedy. She found a disgruntled former Thorn engineer who had kept his own private records of the cover-up. She cross-referenced old geological surveys with the engineer's documents, creating an irrefutable timeline of the leak and the conspiracy that followed. She now held the soul of Thorn Industries in her hands. She could have leaked it to the press and watched the company implode from afar. But that wasn't enough. She wanted to look Marcus Thorn in the eye when his world ended. She requested a meeting with him through her position at Sterling Coal, under the pretext of discussing a potential merger. He agreed, intrigued by the reputation of the brilliant Lena Petrova. She arrived at Thorn Manor, the same place she had been cast out of 5 years ago. This time, she wore a suit that cost more than she used to make in a year. The same severe housekeeper showed her into Marcus's study, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of old leather and power. Marcus was there, along with a haggard-looking Julian and a pale, drawn Serafina. They had been summoned by their father, though they didn't know why. They looked at Lena with curiosity, the faint, arrogant dismissal of their class. They did not recognize the ghost before them. "Miss Petrova," Marcus began, his voice smooth and commanding. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Lena didn't sit. She walked to the center of the room and placed a thick file on his mahogany desk. "We're not here to discuss a merger, Mr. Thorne." He looked at the file, then back at her, his brow furrowing. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a tidal wave. "Ilara Vance." The change in the room was electric. Serafina gasped. Julian's face went white. Marcus Thorne's composure finally, irrevocably cracked. The stone mask crumbled, revealing the frail, panicked man beneath. "You," he whispered. "Me," she confirmed. She gestured to the file. "That contains detailed, irrefutable proof that in 1998, a Thorne chemical plant in Havenwood poisoned an entire community, and that you personally orchestrated the cover-up. It includes signed affidavits from victims, internal memos, and the testimony of your own chief engineer." She let the words hang in the air, heavy and toxic. "I'm giving you a choice," she continued, her voice cold as the marble floor he'd thrown money on. "By morning, I can give this to every major news outlet and the Department of Justice. Thorne Industries will cease to exist by the end of the year. Your family name will be synonymous with poison and death for generations. You will all face prison time." She paused, letting the reality of her threat sink in. "Or," she said, her gaze unwavering, "you will sign over a controlling 51% stake of Thorne Industries to a blind trust that I control. You will resign as CEO. Julian and Serafina will be removed from the board. You will live out your days as figureheads, wealthy but powerless, watching your legacy become mine." Julian lunged forward, his face contorted in rage. "You bitch. You'll get nothing." "It's already done, Julian," Lena said, not even flinching. "The documents are already in the hands of my lawyers, set to release automatically if they don't hear from me by a specific time. Your pathetic outburst changes nothing." Marcus Thorne, the titan of industry, looked truly old for the first time. He stared at Ilara, the daughter he had discarded, now the arbiter of his fate. He saw not the gutter rat he had dismissed, but a formidable queen who had outmaneuvered him at every turn. In her cold gray eyes, he saw his own ruthlessness reflected back at him, perfected and sharpened to a killing edge. He sank into his chair, defeated. "Draw up the papers," he said, his voice a hollow echo of its former power. Weeks later, Lena Petrova, the newly appointed chairperson of Thorne Industries, stood in the penthouse office that had once been Marcus's. The city sprawled beneath her, a glittering prize. She had won. Julian was in a self-imposed exile, his spirit broken. Serafina was battling lawsuits, her beauty faded by stress and public scorn. Marcus was a ghost in his own company, a relic of a bygone era. She picked up a framed photo on the desk. It was of Marcus, Julian and Serafina, smiling at a long-ago gala, the picture of wealth and happiness. Ilara looked at their faces, the faces that had haunted her for 5 years. She felt no joy, no elation, just a quiet, profound emptiness. The fire of her revenge had consumed her past, her grief, and her old self. It had forged her into something powerful and unbreakable, but it had also burned away everything else. She had taken their legacy. She had claimed her power. But as she stared out at the cold, impersonal city, she realized her victory was as silent and gray as the world she had fought so hard to escape. She was queen of a kingdom of ashes, and the only person left to rule was herself.